Efeolua had always been a quiet soul, a gentle observer of the world, rather than an active participant. She was born in Lagos, Nigeria, a city that never slept, yet despite the chaos and noise around her, she often felt disconnected. People rushed past her, each person engrossed in their own world, but Efeolua's world seemed still. She lived alone in a small apartment. The walls painted a soft cream, and her furniture was minimalist. Her days blurred together in a routine that she never questioned. Wake up, go to work, come back home, and repeat. Her colleagues and friends often invited her to join gatherings, but she always declined. "I'm too tired," she'd say, though she knew deep down that the real reason was that she felt a sense of invisibility in the crowd. As much as she longed for connection, she never quite felt like she belonged. Relationships had always seemed like an effort she wasn't ready to make. She had grown accustomed to her own company, even if it came with a sense of loneliness that gnawed at her heart when the city's noise died down at night. Despite the loneliness, there was a certain comfort in her routine. It was predictable, and that was all Efeolua could ask for. She had long ago stopped hoping for anything more, but the emptiness she felt would sometimes become overwhelming, and she would sit in her small apartment, staring out of the window, watching the lights of the busy city below her, wondering what it would feel like to truly belong. One rainy evening, her life took an unexpected turn. She was returning home from work, exhausted and lost in thought, when she noticed something strange in the corner of the street near her apartment. A small, wet dog shivered under a tree. His fur was matted, and he looked up at her with eyes full of fear and vulnerability. Efeolua's initial instinct was to keep walking. She wasn't much of a dog person, but something in the way the dog looked at her tugged at her heart. She couldn't leave him there. He was just a stray, but his pleading eyes made her pause. She hesitated, then knelt down. The dog, who seemed to be both cautious and desperate, stepped toward her slowly. Without thinking twice, she gently scooped him into her arms. His small body trembled in her grasp, and she whispered softly to him, unsure of why she was doing it, but knowing that she couldn't leave him behind. She brought him home, and from that moment, everything changed. The moment she closed the door behind her with the small dog in her arms, Efeolua didn't realize that she had just begun the most profound relationship of her life. She hadn't expected to take in a dog. She didn't even know how to care for one. But something in her heart told her that she had made the right decision. She named him Olamide, meaning "my wealth has come." And as the days passed, their bond grew stronger. Olamide wasn't just a pet. He became a presence in her life, a quiet, loving companion who never asked for much. He would follow her everywhere, his small body always close by. In the mornings, Olamide would sit by her feet as she sipped her tea, his eyes constantly watching her as if to say, "I'm here." When she worked from home, Olamide would lie beside her desk, occasionally letting out a soft whimper as if reminding her he was still there. When she came home after work, Olamide greeted her as if it had been days since they last saw each other, tail wagging, eyes full of excitement. His unshakable loyalty made Efeolua feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, needed. Soon, she found herself becoming attached to him. She started looking forward to his companionship. No longer did she feel entirely alone. Olamide was always there when she needed him, whether it was a quiet evening on the couch or a long walk around the block. She would talk to him about her day, even though she knew he didn't understand. But in a strange way, she felt like he did. Efeolua had never been one to open up to others, but Olamide had a way of making her feel safe, of making her feel understood without saying a word. She had always been afraid of allowing others into her life, of opening herself up to the possibility of getting hurt. But with Olamide, there was no fear. He was there, and that was enough. It felt as if the emptiness inside her had finally been filled. But as she grew closer to Olamide, she began to notice something troubling. Whenever she tried to go out, even for just a short while, Olamide would grow restless, scratching at the door and whining. At first, it seemed like a minor inconvenience, but soon it became clear that Olamide wasn't just attached to her. He was becoming possessive. Efeoluwa couldn't deny that her bond with Olamide was growing deeper. At first, it was comforting to have his constant companionship. She didn't have to face the world alone anymore. She had Olamide. They spent their days together, walking in the park, playing fetch in her small backyard, or just sitting side by side in the apartment. But as time passed, she realized that Olamide's behavior was becoming increasingly protective. Whenever someone visited her apartment, Olamide would bark loudly, and if anyone tried to approach her, he would growl, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Efeoluwa didn't mind at first. It was kind of sweet that Olamide was so protective of her. But as the days wore on, it started to feel suffocating. She couldn't have friends over without Olamide interrupting. Every time someone new came into her life, whether it was a friend or even a potential romantic interest, Olamide would act as though they were a threat. His growls would intensify, and he would plant himself firmly between her and the visitor. One afternoon, Efeoluwa invited Bolu, a man she had met a few weeks ago at a mutual friend's gathering, over to her apartment. She had grown fond of him and felt a connection, but the moment he stepped through the door, Olamide began to growl. Efeoluwa tried to reassure Bolu, but the tension in the room was undeniable. Olamide's behavior made it impossible to have a normal conversation. Bolu, visibly uncomfortable, eventually stood up and left. Efeoluwa sat there, stunned. She couldn't understand why Olamide acted that way, but she knew that something had to change. She didn't want to lose a potential relationship, but it felt like Olamide had become more important than anyone else. She had no answers, only questions. How could she live her life with Olamide's possessiveness taking center stage? Was it fair to expect others to accept her bond with the dog, even if it meant pushing them away? As the days went by, Efeoluwa became more and more isolated. It wasn't just the people around her who felt the strain. It was also the internal conflict that she couldn't ignore. Olamide had been her anchor, but at what cost? The life she had always dreamed of, full of connection and love, was slipping further away, and she didn't know how to fix it. Efeoluwa had always been careful about her choices, cautious about opening herself up to others. But when the opportunity came for her to study abroad in Abuja, she couldn't ignore it. This was everything she had worked for, a chance to advance in her career, to experience something new, to get away from the routine she had been trapped in. It was a dream come true, but there was one thing that held her back. Olamide? The thought of leaving him behind filled her with guilt. Olamide had been with her through so much, her loneliness, her fears, and her internal battles. She had built a life with him, and the idea of leaving him behind seemed impossible. Yet, the opportunity was right in front of her, and she knew she had to make a decision. For days, she wrestled with her emotions. She tried to picture her life in Abuja, the excitement of new experiences, new people, and new possibilities. But every time she thought about it, her mind wandered back to Olamide. Would he be okay without her? Could she really leave him behind? One evening, after receiving the acceptance letter, Efeoluwa sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling as she held the letter in her hands. She looked at Olamide, who was lying beside her, watching her with his gentle eyes. She knew what she had to do, but the thought of leaving him made her heart ache. The next morning, as she began packing her bags, Olamide sensed that something was wrong. He paced back and forth in the apartment, whining softly. Efeoluwa tried to reassure him, but it didn't seem to work. His behavior had grown more restless with each passing moment, and it was clear that he didn't want her to go. That night, just before her flight, Efeoluwa returned from the store to find her passport torn to pieces on the floor. Olamide sat in the middle of the mess, wagging his tail as if nothing was wrong. Efeoluwa stood frozen, staring at the destruction. Her heart sank. How could this have happened? The future she had worked so hard for was slipping away. She realized then that her attachment to Olamide ran deeper than she had ever imagined. The thought of leaving him behind had been too much for him to bear. And so, her dreams seemed to fade before her eyes. She was caught between her future and the bond that had become her entire world. As the days passed, Efeoluwa began to notice a subtle shift in her life. The arrival of a new potential connection, Bolu, should have been a relief, a sign that maybe she was moving forward. Bolu was kind, easygoing, and genuinely interested in getting to know her. Yet the moment he entered her apartment, everything shifted. Olamide, who had once been her constant, now appeared as something more than just a dog. His deep-set eyes, usually filled with affection, now held a possessive edge as he stood at attention between her and Bolu, guarding her with a fierce determination. Efeoluwa tried to introduce Bolu to Olamide gently, but the dog's behavior grew increasingly territorial. Each time Bolu made an attempt to sit next to her or speak to her, Olamide would growl, his posture rigid with warning. Efeoluwa would try to calm the dog, but it only escalated the tension in the room. Bolu, caught off guard by the dog's reaction, began to retreat, his face twisted with confusion and discomfort. The situation became unbearable, and after just a few minutes, Bolu excused himself, clearly unnerved by the situation. The door closed behind Bolu, and Efeoluwa sat in the silence, staring at Olamide, who was now lying on the floor, his gaze never leaving her. The tension in the room was thick. She had always known that Olamide was protective, but she hadn't anticipated the level of possessiveness he was capable of. It wasn't just that he didn't want anyone close to her. It was as though he didn't want anyone at all to share space with her, not even for a second. As the days went by, Efeoluwa found herself torn between two worlds. She loved Olamide, of course, but there was an undeniable pull to connect with other people. She had tried to date before, but the emotional weight of Olamide's constant presence had always made it impossible. She wasn't even sure if she was capable of forming a healthy relationship with someone outside of Olamide's orbit. And yet, there was a part of her that longed for the companionship and affection Bolu offered. She couldn't deny the attraction and connection she felt with him. But Olamide's jealousy was making it harder and harder to maintain any sort of meaningful interaction with him. One night, as Efeoluwa lay in bed, Olamide curled up next to her. She began to feel the weight of her situation. She loved him, yes, but was this the kind of love she wanted to nurture for the rest of her life? Was she holding herself back because of her attachment to a dog who wouldn't let anyone else into her world? She didn't know the answers, but she felt that the time had come for a decision. Was she going to let Olamide's behavior continue to isolate her from the possibility of other relationships, or would she finally confront the emotional barrier that had held her captive for so long? Efeoluwa's inner conflict continued to grow. The question that had been lingering in her mind for days now became impossible to ignore. Could she ever truly have a fulfilling life outside of her attachment to Olamide? The dog had become her rock, her only source of comfort, and the thought of relinquishing that bond was both terrifying and painful. But was it healthy? She had tried dating before, but it had never worked. Each time she tried to build a connection, she found herself drawn back to Olamide. He was her emotional anchor, and yet she realized that his possessiveness was starting to erode her ability to function as an independent person. One afternoon, she sat down with Folarin, a colleague she had been getting to know in Abuja. Folarin had always been friendly, patient, and understanding. Their conversations were easy and effortless, but there was something about him that made Efeoluwa hesitant to take things further. She had never opened up about her bond with Olamide, afraid that anyone would judge her for it. But now she found herself confiding in him, telling him about her struggles with attachment and how she felt like Olamide had become the center of her universe. "You're always talking about Olamide like he's your whole life," Folarin said, his voice soft but concerned. "But what about you, Efeoluwa? What do you want?" The question caught her off guard. What did she want? She didn't even know anymore. She loved Olamide, but it was as though she had placed all her emotional needs on the dog's shoulders. The thought of trying to make room for someone else in her life felt impossible. Olamide's constant attention and neediness made it difficult to see a future that didn't revolve around him. Folarin's words stayed with her long after the conversation ended. That night, as she sat on the couch with Olamide curled up next to her, she found herself wondering if she was truly living her own life, or if she was simply existing in a world created by her attachment to a dog. Her mind was a whirlpool of confusion, torn between wanting to hold on to Olamide and the yearning to experience a life that involved more than just the two of them. As the days wore on, Efeoluwa felt the weight of the decision she had to make. The life she had built with Olamide had been filled with comfort and security, but it was also stifling. She realized that in order to move forward in her life, whether it was pursuing a career, forming meaningful human relationships, or even simply finding a sense of peace within herself, she had to let go of the emotional dependency she had developed on Olamide. The opportunity in Abuja was a dream come true, a chance to build a future, explore new possibilities, and finally escape the isolation she had felt for so long. But the question remained, could she really leave Olamide behind? Could she make that choice without feeling guilty for abandoning the one being that had given her so much love and support? Her parents were supportive, telling her to take the opportunity. But there was one problem. She couldn't fathom the idea of leaving Olamide in the city, knowing that he might not understand why she was leaving him behind. She couldn't bring him with her due to the strict no-pet policies at her new accommodation, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing him forever. After many sleepless nights, Efeoluwa made the painful decision to part with Olamide. She reached out to Jide, her kind neighbor, and asked if he could take care of him. Jide agreed, understanding the bond Efeoluwa shared with her dog. The moment she handed Olamide over to him was one of the hardest things she had ever done. Olamide looked up at her with those familiar eyes, and she fought back tears. She whispered to him softly, "I'll always love you, Olamide, but I need to move on." The empty apartment felt colder than it ever had before. As she stood there, the reality of her choice hit her. She was alone again, but this time, she wasn't sure if she was ready for the life she had chosen. Days after leaving Olamide with Jide felt like a blur. Efeoluwa moved to Abuja, but her heart remained behind. The memories of Olamide's loyal gaze, his constant companionship, and his playful energy haunted her. It was as though she had left a part of herself behind. In Abuja, life was busy, and she threw herself into her work, hoping that it would distract her from the sense of loss she felt. The city, vibrant and full of opportunity, was different from Lagos in many ways. Yet, the loneliness she had once experienced seemed to follow her here too. She met new people, Folarin, who was kind and supportive, and others who brought light into her life, but no one could fill the void that Olamide had left. One day, after weeks of feeling disconnected, Efeoluwa visited a dog shelter during a lunch break. She wasn't sure why she was there, but as she walked through the rows of cages, one dog caught her eye. A small, scruffy dog with big brown eyes stared back at her. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and she felt a flicker of recognition. It wasn't Olamide, but something about the dog's eyes made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. She walked closer to the cage, and the dog wagged its tail, as though sensing her presence. Efeoluwa smiled softly, her heart a little lighter. Perhaps this was the beginning of something new, something that didn't require her to forget the past, but instead to move forward with it, carrying the lessons and love that Olamide had given her. It had been weeks since Efeoluwa had left Lagos for Abuja. At first, the bustling new city had been a welcome distraction. The fresh air of new opportunities, a new environment, and a chance to explore different paths in her career had seemed like exactly what she needed. But the gap left by Olamide was undeniable. She missed the simplicity of their life together, the quiet moments spent in each other's company. The memory of his comforting presence lingered in every quiet space in her new apartment, where the silence was sometimes too loud. Despite her longing, something had shifted in Efeoluwa. She was no longer the same woman who had clung to the past for safety. The dog shelter visit had stirred something inside her. The dog's eyes had reminded her of Olamide's loyalty, and as she walked through the shelter, she couldn't help but feel drawn to the idea of bringing another companion into her life. She knew it wasn't about replacing Olamide. Nothing could ever replace the bond they shared, but it was about learning to love again, to find a new source of joy and companionship. One Friday afternoon, after a long day at work, Efeoluwa decided to return to the shelter. She walked through the rows of cages, stopping at each one to look at the dogs. Some were energetic, some shy, but there was one dog, a small, scruffy creature, that caught her eye. His brown eyes sparkled with intelligence, and his tail wagged when their eyes met. Something about him resonated with Efeoluwa, and she couldn't resist. She asked to meet him, and within moments, they were sitting together in a quiet corner of the shelter. The dog, whose name was now Tunde, leaned against her as she stroked his fur. It was an odd feeling, almost like she was giving herself permission to move forward. There was still a piece of her that would always belong to Olamide, but she realized that her heart had space for more. That afternoon, she adopted Tunde. He wasn't the same as Olamide, and he never would be, but he was his own unique companion, and he filled her life with a sense of purpose. As she drove home, Tunde sitting comfortably beside her, Efeoluwa smiled. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was walking towards something beautiful. With Tunde by her side, Efeoluwa found herself adjusting to the rhythms of life in Abuja. The city was bustling, but it felt like a fresh start. Her mornings began with Tunde playfully chasing after her slippers or rolling around on the bed, his playful energy infectious. The apartment, once silent and still, was now filled with the sounds of his playful barks, the sound of his paws padding across the floor, and the warm comfort of his presence. As she walked around the city with Tunde, she began to feel a sense of community. The park that had once felt like a place of isolation was now a place where she could connect with other dog owners, sharing stories about their pets. It was a small thing, but each time she smiled at another dog lover, she felt her world grow a little larger. The loneliness she had once felt was beginning to dissipate, replaced by a quiet confidence in her ability to adapt. Her work life in Abuja was thriving too. She had taken the leap to pursue her career with a renewed focus, knowing that she had the space and freedom to grow. Follerin, her supportive colleague, had become a close friend. Though she had been wary of opening herself up to him at first, she realized that he respected her boundaries and understood her need for space. Their conversations continued to be light and easy, but there was something more now, a sense of trust that hadn't existed before. But it wasn't just about her career or her social circle. Efeoluwa had learned to embrace herself, to let go of the fears that had once held her back. She had learned that attachment didn't have to be suffocating. It could be liberating, and it could come in many forms. One day, as she sat in her favorite cafe in Abuja, sipping coffee with Follerin, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. Tunde was curled up under the table, and the weight of her past no longer felt as heavy. She realized that she didn't need to choose between her past and her future. Both had shaped her, both had given her strength, and both had taught her lessons. The key was learning to balance them. Efeoluwa wasn't the same woman who had arrived in Abuja months ago. She was stronger now, more open to life's possibilities. And as Tunde looked up at her with those familiar brown eyes, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, love, and the freedom to live fully.